3 years ago, a single clause in a contract destroyed her career. Tonight, she heard another one being quietly rewritten, worth $20 million. The only problem? She wasn't sitting at the negotiation table anymore. She was pouring wine, and no one knew she understood exactly what was happening. She was holding a bottle of red wine when she heard it. The lie. One softened clause, one missing condition, $20 million quietly shifting direction. No one else in that private dining room understood Korean well enough to notice, and the only person who did was the waitress. If she spoke, she could lose everything again. If she stayed silent, a fraud would succeed right in front of her. Welcome to Untold Journey Stories. If you're drawn to stories about quiet courage and second chances, subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because this one doesn't unfold the way you expect. I've replayed that moment in my mind more times than I can count. Not because it's dramatic on the surface. There were no raised voices, no shattered glasses, no cinematic music swelling in the background. Just a polished dining table overlooking the Seattle waterfront. Crystal glasses. Investors in tailored suits. A CEO confident in the deal he believed he was securing. And a woman in a navy apron who was never meant to be part of the conversation. Her name was Caroline Whitmore, 34 years old, quiet posture, observant eyes, the kind of server who anticipates what you need before you realize you need it. But what no one in that room knew was this. Caroline used to sit on the other side of tables like that, not with a tray in her hand, but with a headset. She had been a certified conference interpreter, the kind hired when negotiations crossed borders and languages could no longer afford ambiguity. She specialized in high-stakes corporate agreements, manufacturing rights, distribution channels, intellectual property protections. In that world, precision isn't impressive, it's mandatory. And then her name was attached to a contractual disaster. A multinational pharmaceutical merger unraveled after a translated liability clause shifted millions in responsibility. Her digital signature was on the draft. Media outlets didn't wait for forensic investigations. They ran with the simplest narrative. Interpreter error. License suspended. Clients vanished. Reputation fractured overnight. I want to pause here because this is the part most people underestimate. When your profession is built entirely on trust, suspicion alone is enough to exile you, even if you're later cleared, even if evidence shows the document was altered after it left your hands. The market moves on faster than the truth can catch up. By the time investigators quietly confirmed unauthorized edits by a legal associate, the damage was done. Caroline's phone had stopped ringing, so she adapted. She took a job at Harbor and Elm, a waterfront restaurant where no one Googled her name and no one cared about accreditation. But here's what I find almost poetic. Skills don't disappear just because titles do. You can take the interpreter out of the boardroom. You can't take the boardroom out of the interpreter. And that's why on that night, when a Korean executive outlined a binding exclusivity clause tied to quarterly production targets, Caroline felt it immediately. The hired interpreter translated it as a flexible arrangement, something open to renegotiation. It wasn't. The original language was explicit. If performance metrics weren't met within 18 months, distribution rights would automatically revert. No ambiguity, no softness. Caroline stood there, bottle in hand, listening to millions of dollars quietly redefined. This is the moment that fascinates me. Not because she noticed. Of course she noticed. Expertise doesn't vanish with the uniform. It's what noticing forced her to confront. The last time she was linked to a contract gone wrong, she trusted the system to sort it out. She stayed procedural, careful, silent in public. This time, the distortion was happening live. And here's the uncomfortable truth. It is far easier to rebuild a life around invisibility than to risk humiliation again. She could have convinced herself it wasn't her place. She could have blamed acoustics. She could have poured the wine and walked away. Instead, she stepped toward the table. That step, small, controlled, almost polite, was the beginning of everything that followed. And I keep thinking, if you were her, would you have moved closer to the truth? Or would you have chosen the safety of silence? To understand why that single step toward the table mattered so much, you have to understand what it cost her the first time she trusted the truth to defend itself. Before Harbor and Elm, before the apron, before the careful invisibility, Caroline Whitmore had built her life around precision. She wasn't just fluent in multiple languages, she was fluent in consequence. In high-level interpretation, you don't translate words. You transfer liability. You carry regulatory nuance across cultures. You safeguard intent when millions of dollars are moving faster than trust can keep up. 3 years earlier, she had been assigned to interpret for a pharmaceutical merger between a U.S.-based research firm and a European biotech company. It was the kind of deal that required marathon negotiation sessions. Patent protections, manufacturing jurisdictions, liability caps in the event of adverse clinical outcomes. I've read enough about cases like this to know how fragile those rooms are. Everyone smiles, everyone says partnership, but underneath the table, risk is being calculated down to decimal points. Caroline did what she had always done. She translated faithfully. Every clause, every conditional, every narrowing of responsibility. Weeks later, the merger imploded. A liability clause, specifically tied to post-market clinical risk, had been rendered in a way that shifted financial responsibility disproportionately onto the American firm. The fallout was swift. Share prices dipped. Legal teams mobilized. Internal investigations began. Her digital authentication appeared on the translated draft. And here's the brutal reality of professional optics. When something collapses publicly, institutions look for the most replaceable point in the chain. An interpreter is easier to question than a board of executives. Media outlets framed it as negligence. Industry forums debated declining standards in linguistic certification. Anonymous commentary suggested incompetence. Caroline tried to stay rational. She cooperated fully with the internal review. She submitted her original working notes, timestamp recordings, parallel draft comparisons. But investigations are slow, and reputational damage is immediate. Her certification board suspended her license pending inquiry. Clients postponed contracts until clarity emerged, which, in corporate language, means indefinitely. What strikes me most isn't the external fallout, it's the psychological one. When your profession is built on accuracy, being publicly associated with error feels like an identity fracture. She began questioning her own memory, replaying sessions in her head, wondering if fatigue had blurred something. Months later, forensic IT specialists uncovered the truth. Post-session edits had been made to the contract draft by a junior legal associate attempting to adjust liability exposure without triggering renegotiation. The edits altered phrasing after her authenticated submission. Technically, she was cleared, but the correction was procedural, quiet, administrative. No headline ever announced her exoneration with the same volume as the accusation. And this is where I find myself unsettled, not just by her story, but by the system surrounding it. Institutions are efficient at distancing themselves from controversy. They are far less motivated to restore individuals once the storm passes. During that time, her father was recovering from cardiac complications. Insurance covered some expenses, not all. Pride has a way of dissolving when medical bills stack higher than professional opportunities. So she made a decision that many highly capable people make when prestige becomes unstable. She chose stability over status. She accepted work where her past would not be examined, where her name badge did not trigger industry gossip, where she could earn quietly and rebuild privately. But here's what I think is critical to understand. She did not abandon her standards. She studied updated international contract frameworks on her own. She followed regulatory shifts. She kept her language sharp, not because anyone was watching, but because identity, when it's authentic, doesn't evaporate under pressure. Which is why that night in the private dining room was not random. It was a collision between who she had been publicly discredited as and who she still was internally. The first time her name became attached to a distorted contract, she relied on formal processes to correct the narrative. This time, she was facing distortion in real time. And that difference changes everything, because once you've experienced what silence costs, you no longer measure risk the same way. That difference is what turned an ordinary service shift into a moral crossroads. By the time the second clause was mistranslated, Caroline was no longer unsure of what she was hearing. The first discrepancy could have been dismissed as tonal interpretation. The second confirmed pattern. The third removed doubt entirely. What unsettled her wasn't just the altered language. It was the strategy behind it. The Korean executive was outlining a performance safeguard tied to phased technology transfer. In the original phrasing, access to proprietary manufacturing data would be contingent upon verified quarterly benchmarks, clear sequence, clear accountability, cause and consequence locked together. The interpreter reframed it as collaborative flexibility, suggesting adjustments could be mutually discussed if targets were not met. That sounds harmless if you're not trained to listen structurally, but conditional language in international contracts functions like architecture. You remove one load-bearing beam and the entire framework shifts. Upon verification is not the same as following discussion. Automatic reversion is not the same as subject to review. Caroline felt the shift the way a musician hears a wrong note in a familiar composition. Subtle, but unmistakable. She moved behind Daniel Mercer's chair, refilling water, buying time. Her mind was racing, but not chaotically. It was clinical. She replayed the original Korean phrasing in her head, mapping it against standard commercial code, the verb tense used, the particle indicating obligation rather than suggestion, the embedded timeline marker that eliminated discretionary delay. This was not fatigue, it was manipulation. And here is where I think the human dimension becomes more powerful than the technical one. She had already experienced what it felt like to be associated with a distorted contract. She knew the aftermath, the accusations, the simplification, the quiet professional exile. She understood that once a flawed agreement is signed, unraveling it costs exponentially more than correcting it in the moment. But she also understood something else. Interpreters are trained to be invisible conduits. You do not insert yourself. You do not editorialize. You do not become part of the narrative. For her to speak would violate not just restaurant protocol, but professional conditioning. I imagine the internal dialogue wasn't dramatic. It was probably practical. What if I'm wrong? What if I misheard? What if this isn't my place anymore? That last question is the one that lingers with me. Not my place anymore. Because when someone's professional identity has been publicly shaken, they often internalize displacement. They start believing expertise is conditional on title, but skill does not disappear when employment status changes. Another clause was rendered inaccurately, this time concerning indemnification in the event of production defects. Again, risk softened. Again, responsibility diffused. Caroline's pulse quickened, but her thinking sharpened. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She was auditing in real time. And this is something I want to underline for anyone listening. Courage is rarely loud. It is often the quiet decision to act in alignment with what you know to be true, even when your authority has been stripped. She stepped forward slightly, positioning herself within peripheral acknowledgement range. Not interrupting yet, just close enough to be heard if necessary. The room continued. Nods exchanged. Pens hovered above paper. Then came the exclusivity clause, the one tied to distribution territory across Southeast Asia. The Korean executive's wording was explicit. Exclusivity would terminate automatically if performance ratios were unmet within 18 months. The interpreter translated it as a preferred arrangement subject to performance discussion. That was the moment. There are times when silence feels like self-preservation, and there are times when silence feels like participation. Caroline understood that distinction instantly. She set the water pitcher down. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She asked for permission to clarify a linguistic nuance. That restraint is important because it reveals intention. She wasn't trying to expose someone. She was trying to protect the integrity of the agreement. And when she repeated the original statement in Korean, measured, precise, unembellished, you could feel the atmosphere shift. Not because she was dramatic, but because truth, when reintroduced into a distorted space, creates tension. Everyone turned toward the waitress, not as staff, but as the only person in the room who had been listening without agenda. The moment everyone turned toward her, the balance of power in that room shifted, quietly but unmistakably. Daniel Mercer didn't react with anger at first. He reacted with calculation. You could see it in the way he leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing not at Caroline, but at the information gap that had just opened in front of him. Clarify, he said. Not confront. Not challenge. Clarify. Caroline did exactly that. She repeated the original Korean statement in full, then rendered it into English with deliberate pacing. She didn't embellish. She didn't emphasize the discrepancy. She simply translated, complete, structured, and technically aligned with commercial terminology. The Korean executive nodded once, subtle but definitive. The hired interpreter, Ryan Caldwell, interjected almost immediately. He framed his earlier wording as contextual interpretation, arguing that tone and cultural flexibility justified the softer phrasing. He suggested that literal translation could distort collaborative intent. Now here's where things became revealing. Caroline didn't argue tone. She addressed structure. She referenced the grammatical construction of obligation embedded in the original sentence. She explained how the verb tense indicated automatic consequence rather than discretionary review. She cited how similar phrasing is consistently interpreted in bilateral trade agreements under South Korean commercial standards. She wasn't attacking him. She was anchoring the room back to linguistic architecture. I find this important because credibility is rarely built through force. It's built through composure. Daniel requested a brief recess. Documents were reopened. Digital drafts were pulled up. The Korean delegation reviewed their written proposal alongside Caroline's verbal rendering. Consistency emerged on her side. Then a deeper layer surfaced. Earlier email drafts stored on Ryan's laptop contained phrasing closer to what he had spoken during the meeting than what appeared in the investor's official proposal. The shifts weren't random. They systematically reduced automatic penalties and softened liability triggers. The pattern was too coherent to dismiss as improvisation. And this is where the atmosphere changed from tension to gravity. No one accused him outright, but the room no longer trusted him as the neutral conduit. I want to pause here and reflect on something that struck me when I first heard this story. Exposure didn't happen because Caroline attacked deception. It happened because she restored accuracy. The truth revealed the distortion without theatrics. Ryan's explanations grew thinner under scrutiny. He referenced efficiency, relationship building, smoother negotiations. But smoothing language in contracts isn't diplomacy. It's risk redistribution. Eventually, the Korean delegation requested that Caroline remain in the room for the remainder of the session as an independent linguistic verifier. That request alone speaks volumes. Within an hour, her role had shifted from peripheral service staff to essential safeguard. The negotiation resumed, this time with heightened attentiveness. Each clause was cross-checked, each conditional clarified, each obligation reaffirmed. And here's the part that resonates with me most deeply. Caroline didn't appear triumphant. She appeared steady. No visible vindication, no subtle satisfaction, just professional alignment. When the meeting concluded, with revised language and postponed signing pending full review, Daniel asked her to stay behind. "Why are you working here?" he asked. It wasn't condescending. It was genuinely perplexed. And this is where the emotional undercurrent returned. Because explaining professional collapse requires vulnerability. It requires reopening a chapter you've been trying to quietly survive. She told him the truth about the pharmaceutical merger, the altered document, the suspension, the quiet exoneration that never repaired public perception. She didn't frame herself as a victim. She framed the event as misalignment between evidence and narrative. Daniel listened longer than most executives do. And as I reflect on this, what strikes me isn't that she exposed someone. It's that she reclaimed authorship of her own credibility. Not through defense, through demonstration. That night, she didn't just correct a clause. She dismantled the assumption that her value was tied to her current job title. And once a room sees that clearly, it cannot unsee it. What happened after that conversation is, in many ways, quieter than the confrontation. But to me, it's the part that carries the most weight. Daniel Mercer did something that most leaders don't make time for. He followed through. Over the next few weeks, his legal department conducted a deeper review, not only of the interrupted negotiation, but of Caroline's past case. He requested archived documentation from the pharmaceutical merger. He brought in an external forensic consultant to examine metadata trails and revision histories. Not because he owed her anything, but because competence, once witnessed, creates a responsibility to take it seriously. The findings confirmed what had once been buried in procedural language. Post-submission edits had altered contractual phrasing after Caroline's authenticated translation was delivered. The liability shift had not originated with her interpretation. Technically, this wasn't new information. It had surfaced years earlier, but this time it was evaluated by someone with both authority and incentive to act on it. Here's what I find significant. Restoration didn't come in the form of public spectacle. There was no viral apology campaign, no press conference correcting old narratives. It came in the form of opportunity. Daniel offered her a role as a contract language compliance advisor within his firm, a position designed specifically to prevent cross-border misinterpretation and ensure that no single intermediary could distort high-value agreements without detection. It wasn't framed as charity. It was framed as structural improvement, and I think that distinction matters deeply. Caroline didn't accept the offer immediately. From what I understand, she asked for a few days. When someone's professional identity has been fractured once, stepping back into that arena isn't just exciting, it's terrifying. There's a vulnerability in re-entering the space that once rejected you, a quiet fear that history might repeat itself. But here's what had changed. The first time she had relied on systems to defend her reputation. This time her credibility had been rebuilt through visible action. Not paperwork, not statements, demonstration. She accepted. The transition wasn't cinematic. It involved onboarding documents, compliance briefings, and long hours reviewing multilingual contract structures. But the symbolism of it, returning not as a disgraced interpreter, but as a safeguard architect, cannot be overstated. When she told her father about the offer, he reportedly listened without interruption. After a moment, he said something simple. "Your name isn't what they said about you. It's what you prove over time." That line stays with me because it reframes reputation. Reputation is external. Identity is internal. One can be attacked, the other can only be surrendered. Caroline could have chosen permanent retreat. She could have defined herself by the period of silence that followed her suspension. Many capable people do. It's safer to shrink than to risk renewed scrutiny. Instead, she did something far more difficult. She remained prepared while invisible. And when visibility returned unexpectedly, she was ready. There's an insight here that I think is worth sitting with. Integrity doesn't always protect you immediately. In fact, sometimes it seems to cost you everything. But integrity compounds quietly. It builds muscle memory. It sharpens instinct. It prepares you for moments you cannot predict. On that night in the private dining room, Caroline didn't just correct a mistranslation. She refused to betray the very standard that had once cost her so much. And maybe that's the deeper lesson. Redemption isn't about erasing what happened. It's about refusing to let what happened dictate who you become. If you were the only person in the room who could hear the distortion, would you risk stepping forward? Caroline did, not because she was fearless, but because she had already learned what silence can take from you. And this time, she chose alignment over safety. When I think about Caroline's story as a whole, what stays with me isn't the exposure of misconduct or the professional comeback. It's the internal shift that happened long before the promotion, long before the job offer. It's the moment she decided that her integrity was not conditional on her title. There's something quietly powerful about a person who continues preparing in private, even after being publicly misunderstood. Caroline didn't sharpen her skills because she was certain opportunity would return. She did it because excellence was part of who she was. And when the defining moment arrived, unexpected, inconvenient, risky, she didn't need to transform into someone brave. She simply acted in alignment with the person she had continued to be all along. The deeper lesson here is this: silence can protect your comfort, but it can also erode your identity. There are moments in life when speaking up may cost you status, approval, or temporary security. But if staying silent forces you to betray what you know is right, the long-term cost is far greater. So how do we apply this today? First, keep developing your skills even when no one is applauding. Private preparation creates public readiness. Second, separate your identity from public opinion. Headlines fade, character compounds. Third, when you recognize a distortion, whether in business, relationships, or personal values, pause and ask yourself, if I don't speak now, what part of me am I teaching to stay quiet? You don't need a boardroom to practice integrity. You practice it in conversations, in decisions, in small corrections that feel uncomfortable but necessary. Now I'm curious. Have you ever faced a moment where speaking up felt risky, but staying silent felt wrong? What did you choose? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can learn from each other's experiences. And if stories like this resonate with you, please subscribe to Untold Journey Stories to support the channel and keep these meaningful conversations going.